Are we ready to begin?
Yes, sir. We can.
Bilkul, I'm ready.
Right. So, folks, today we have with us Dr. Asim Khwaja. He is Director, Center of International Development at the Harvard University and Professor of Public Policy at the Kennedy School of Government. He is well known in Pakistan as well as abroad and became professor at a very young age. I would request Mr. Raja Rafi to formally introduce Professor Khwaja. Raja Sahab, over to you.
Okay.
And
am I audible to everybody?
Yes. My apologies to all the audience.
Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, you are audible, Asim Sahab.
जी राजा रफी साहब आपकी आवाज आ रही है.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was just having some issue at my end. That's why I thought maybe.
Raja Sahab, 1 minute.
Okay.
My apologies to all the audience and Professor Khwaja. Dr. Nadeemul Haq could not be able to join. He had an unforeseen emergency and he is traveling. So I will be moderating this webinar. Raja Sahab, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Raja Rafiola. I am a research fellow at PIDE. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker. His name is Dr. Asim Khwaja. He's a professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also the director of Center for International Development at Harvard University. His research combines extensive fieldwork, rigorous empirical analysis, and microeconomic theory to answer questions that are motivated by and engage with policy. Dr. Khwaja received his BS degrees in economics and in mathematics with computer science from MIT and a PhD in economics from Harvard. He was born in London and has lived in Nigeria and Pakistan before moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts. He continues to enjoy interacting with people from around the globe. I was lucky enough to get to listen to Dr. Asim Khwaja a couple of years ago, and I was really pleased when I reached out to him that he agreed to come and speak to us. So without any further delay, it's over to Dr. Asim Khwaja. I would like to officially welcome him to the PIDE webinar series and taking the time out. Thank you.
So, Dr. Khwaja, it's good to have you. And the topic is very important, beyond COVID-19. Inequality beyond COVID-19, pivoting inequality through opportunities. So we would very much like to hear you on this subject, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm just trying to share my screen, but somehow it's not letting me do a share screen. Do I have co-host privileges on both my accounts?
Sir, you have co-host privileges on both your devices.
That's odd. It doesn't let me. Normally there's a share screen option. Sorry, I'm just trying to get myself set up over here. I'm trying to, I don't see a share screen option. I only see share content, which doesn't allow me to share my screen.
So click on arrow.
Click on the green arrow.
Oh no, I'm doing that. But for some reason, I think have you guys set this up as a normal Zoom call? Or maybe there's some different settings you have at your end. It doesn't allow a screen share. Since I can't do a screen.
So, Dr. Asim, if you can send us the presentation.
Give me 1 second.
And we will try to share from here.
Yeah, I can only do share content. Let me try from my other device. Sorry, guys. I can only share screen from one device, not the other. Okay. I'm going to try and reconnect you in a second just from this device, because otherwise it will be, I won't be able to see you, which is...
Okay. Take your time.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, you need to enter a sharing key or a meeting ID to share a, I think it's something the way you set up permissions. Can you type in the meeting ID again?
Sir, it's 986
Yeah,
3023.
okay, that's a different one from what you guys gave before.
No, the password.
Sir, first Dr. Saab has to enter the key.
Okay,
It's 986 3023 1695.
okay, and if you could just give me the password.
Sir, 38.
Yeah.
381153.
Okay, if you would give me permission.
Sir, try it now, sir.
Okay, hopefully this works now. Let's see. Okay, yeah, it's not letting me, it just keeps filling. I think it's, can you not be live streaming? I think you guys are live streaming and it's creating problems for me. If you can turn off, sorry guys, I hadn't anticipated this. I've done this 1,000 times. It's never happened before. So I don't quite understand why
Sir,
this
I have
is.
shared my email address. If you can send your slides to me, then
That won't work. You can't be running my slides for me. I need to run them myself. Okay, guys, let me just, I'm unfortunately going to have to switch around. Give me a few minutes. I'm just going to have to switch devices. As I would check your Zoom settings, I've done this 1,000 times, it's never happened. So there's something the way you're setting up Zoom, which is creating these issues. I'm going to switch around devices if you just give me a minute now.
Sure.
Dr. Asim, sir, can you please check it now, sir?
Sorry, I was just switching devices. You want me to try again? No, I can't. I'm just gonna connect from my laptop. I don't think there's any point wasting time on this anymore. Okay. Well, this should work. Sorry, I won't be able to annotate because my devices are no longer. I was going to do some markup on this. I was going to do some markup on my screen. I can't do that given the screen where I can mark isn't allowing me to connect.
Okay.
Okay, great. So why don't I jump straight in? So what I really wanted to discuss was kind of two sort of forces which are working together. One is this issue of sort of inequality that we're dealing with. The other is just what's happening due to COVID. And so let me start with the following question, and if people can kind of put this in the chat. So I'm going to ask you a question, which is, would you rather be rich in a poor country or poor in a rich country? Okay, I'm just defining some of these terms. What do these terms mean? So I'm kind of defining them on the side. So if you, let's kind of do this poll. I'm going to use the chat feature over here. So I want people to simply type in A or B. A, if you want to be rich in a poor country, and B, if you want to be poor in a rich country. Okay, so which one of these two? I assume chat is enabled in the settings.
Mansoor, if it is not enabled, please enable the chat.
So if you could just type in whichever one you want to be, rich in a poor country or poor in a rich country.
So I have enabled it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're getting some comments in. Let's start with Kausar. Kausar, you said A, you wanted to be rich in a poor country. Can you explain? If you could unmute.
Mansoor, please allow people to unmute.
Sir, they can unmute themselves, sir.
Okay.
In case, Kausar, you can't, maybe some people don't have the, how about Anna? You also said you chose A, Anna Malik. People are having trouble. Go ahead, yes.
Sir, everyone wants to be rich, so it doesn't matter. But the fact is कि जो है इंसान को पुअर बेशक हो लेकिन कंट्री रिच होना चाहिए, ये बात है. लेकिन हर कोई यही सोचता है, यही चाहता है कि वो खुद रिच हो बेशक कंट्री पुअर हो. So yes.
Okay, so A. Let's get one more. Rahul, you also said A. Can you unmute and explain?
Hello?
Go ahead, Rahul.
Yeah, well, I think being rich in a poorer country, one has a relatively much better purchasing power, and being poor in a rich country, I think it's a much more difficult life.
Sounds good. Mishal wants an option C. Mishal, we'll get to it. I just wanted to create the stark trade-off, but fair point. Let's see someone who are Bs. Mariam, you wanted to be, you'd rather be poor in a rich country. Go ahead, Mariam.
Oh, well, it makes sense. If we're in a country where the infrastructure is better, where I'm assuming there's better healthcare even if you're poor. And I think I have example to support that point. I haven't seen anyone going to become a millionaire in let's say Somalia, but I've seen a lot of people moving from upper middle class families into the developed countries and going there and not being very rich. So I think that's what common sense says.
Okay. Common sense says, why are the other people picking A? It's obvious it should be B. Mahmoud Khalid. I assume this is Gini or?
Sir, sir, it's the relative poverty which matters. I would like to be poor in a rich country because I feel more secure. Being rich in a poor country would always be like pressurizing yourself in terms of being pointed out and rent seeking and others. So being poor in a rich country would be relatively better.
Okay, I don't know if you guys know about Mahmood. I've known for a long time, and his nickname, I don't know if it still is, Mahmood used to be Genie. And Mahmood, was it because of the Gini coefficient? That's the way at least I was always thought of it, as opposed to
it's an honor to be thought like that. But I used to play rugby. There was a gents club in Islamabad way back, so I was basically part of that gents club.
So for today's talk, we'll think of Mahmood's nickname as a Gini coefficient, which is a good measure of inequality. So you guys have given both kind of very sensible arguments for both ways to say, look, there are arguments to be done both ways. What I wanted to show you, the reason I asked this question is, I just wanted to show you if you simply thought of welfare as income, where would you want to be? If you just thought of welfare as even adjusting for cost of living, for purchasing power parity, how would you think? And in that way of thinking, actually, you're better off even after you adjust for income to be poor in a rich country. So I'm just showing you, say, a poor country like Niger, and Niger is the income share of the top 5% is about 21%. The adjusted PPP adjusted income is about 4,000 for someone who's in the top 5% in Niger, as opposed to if you're in Norway, even if you're the poor bottom 5%, you still are earning about 5 times as much as you would if you were in Niger. This is kind of adjusting for a bunch of stuff. And so this is just a way of saying, look, how stark is the difference between countries and within countries, right? Because the difference is massive between countries in income, even the bottom of the between country is higher than the top, substantially higher than the top of a poor country. Now, by the way, this story isn't true if you've looked at the US, interestingly enough. So if I just changed Norway to US, now it's not true. The bottom 5% in the US actually are worse off than the top 5% in Niger. So it also depends on which rich country you're talking about. Norway is a country where there's less inequality. And so that's why, at least in Norway, this works out in favor of Norway. In the US, it doesn't. What I'm really highlighting is this kind of figure, which is, if you look at, it's actually very interesting. So this is just decomposing inequality between and sort of within countries. And if you look at this, what you start seeing very clearly is how important the between country component is. Now, when you start as early as the 1800s, it's actually not that way. Early on, most inequality was within countries. In the last couple of decades, the trend has been the other way around. It's gone more and more kind of between countries. And so that's just something to keep in mind as a potential concern, right? Just keep this in mind as I start talking about the rest of the statistics for today. Okay, this is the same thing I'm just showing you now in a more continuous decomposition between country versus within country inequality, and the same pattern you see. What is interesting though is, while I showed you over here that basically there was more between country, this trend is beginning to change. So gradually we're beginning to add a bit more within country inequality, and you can see that when I do a smaller time series, the within country is beginning to rise. Here is another way to really decompose what's happening in inequality. And I think when you think of inequality overall in like a Gini coefficient, you actually hide something very interesting, which is happening. And what you're hiding is this fact that the inequality change that is really at play is not just, it's not that somehow if you think of an income distribution, kind of the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. That's not what's going on. So the way to read this graph, just in case it kind of looks confusing, so the x-axis is basically the percentile of income. So the 10 is basically the bottom 10%, 99.9 is basically the top 0.1%. And then on the y-axis, what I'm showing you is the change over the 1980 to 2016 period. So this is how much this group's income has grown. And what you see is interesting is if you look at the 40 percentile and below, in fact, they have actually grown quite a lot, right? So this is the rise of the emerging economies that you see over here. I'm kind of pointing my mouse over here. For most people who are kind of middle income people, and this is kind of the squeeze of US and Western Europe during this period, you actually see less growth, right? So when you talk about, if you chopped this graph at this line over here, if you chopped it at 99.9, you would have actually had falling inequality, right? The only reason you see this inequality issue is it's really all the action is coming at this very top, right? At this very top end in the distribution is where you're getting kind of most of the problem. So I want you to think about this and keep this in mind, that the kind of action, if you will, is mostly coming from this kind of very, very rich, right? And think how extreme this is, right? I drew the graph on equal scale just to show this to you, but actually this is not the right scale. My x-axis scale is no longer 10 units of movement over here. So really, if you wanted to draw the graph, unfortunately I can't do it. I can't share the right thing anymore. But you should draw a line kind of which is just jumping straight up vertical over here, right? And so this is telling you that the inequality problem in the world is really a problem of the very, very, very elite in the world. That's what's creating all. So whenever you think of inequality, keep this picture in mind. The poor have actually done better than the middle class and the rich. The issue is the very rich have done incredibly well. And that's what's creating most of this kind of division across. Okay. So let me keep going. COVID-19 has worsened the situation. It's made things much, much worse than they were. And let me explain why that's happening. Just show you some data on that. So here I'm showing you a couple of different recessions. And what you can see is interesting is if you look at all the, and what I'm showing you in the recessions is, I'm showing you different quartiles of income. So the green now is the richest 25%. And the purple line is the bottom 25%. And when you look at whether it be the 1990, the 2001, or the 2008 recessions, in these recessions, yes, it is the case typically that the purple line, the poor tend to be slightly worse than the green line, although not necessarily true in 1990. But look at what the COVID crisis is. It's much, much stark. So the COVID crisis, unlike other recessions, has really hit the poor much more, right? So this is telling you that whatever the situation of inequality you saw to begin with, that situation, because of the COVID pandemic, has gotten much, much worse. Okay, this is another way of thinking about the COVID crisis. So what I'm showing you over about 200 years now is 150, 160 years, is this graph of what share of the world, what share of countries in the world are in a crisis, right? Are facing a contraction in GDP. And again, you can see that other than the Great Depression, the COVID crisis is also global, right? It's pretty much 100%. Almost every country in the world has faced a contraction, right? So this is another way of sort of highlighting what's happening. Now, again, this is the same picture I showed you before. This is at a time when the wealthy, right, people who are earning above $1 million, own about half of the world's wealth, right? So the richest 1% own about half of the world's entire wealth. Same picture I gave you before, just a different way of showing that. What is also interesting is when you think of these very rich actually have ended up, because of the COVID crisis, they have ended up actually saving more. Interestingly enough, the decline in spending during this crisis is driven by the rich. The rich have actually dropped their spending a lot more than the poor have. Anyone have any ideas why? If you want to raise your hand, anyone think why this is the case? Why are the rich cutting their spending back, tightening their belt much more than the poor are? What do you guys think? I can't, unfortunately, now again, given the setup. Ringchen, you want to talk about it? Ringchen? Ringchen doesn't have a mic, so he says lockdown.
So he's saying it's because of lockdown, people don't have opportunities to spend. Exactly.
So people don't have opportunity to spend, but the poor can spend. That's the question we want to ask. Sayyid Iqbal says they're investing in crypto. Nazim said there's due to expectation of lower return. There's an even simpler explanation. Raza says the rich spend more on services. Explain that a bit more, Raza. It's a bit more than just services. Yeah, there you go. So I think, Navera, you want to explain yours? Navera, go ahead, unmute.
Poor already don't have enough to spend on luxuries. They spend on the essential items, and they have to spend on the essential items to live. So that's why their spending might not have dropped that much as compared to the rich people.
Exactly. Take your canonical model. That's exactly right, Navera. In your canonical model, let's say the poor are spending on necessities, like let's say food. If you look at the income budget of the poor on necessities versus luxuries, most of what they're spending will probably be is much more necessities. When you look at the rich, it's not that the rich will spend 50% of their budget on food, right? And so if you've stopped taking vacations to fancy places, you've got your spending. And so what's going to happen, and this is interesting in this crisis, not only is the income shock unequal, what's going to happen is the savings, and you see this actually, there's more savings going on. Like COVID has increased savings in the US, right? This is just a graph showing that the increase in savings, American personal savings, is a lot more than the spending change. So all of this is going to exacerbate the situation I just said. So imagine you started off with the very rich being the ones who are mostly driving inequality. The very rich are essentially saving in the COVID crisis. So when you look at net savings of the rich, they're going up actually. So not only was their income really high, their net savings are also high. So when you think about recovery from the crisis, the poor now have blown away their savings as well. They had no choice, right? So their incomes fell, they had to keep spending the same thing. So their cushion, their buffer has gone down, while the rich have an even bigger buffer, right? Yes, you maybe didn't enjoy last year as much because you couldn't go to the fancy vacation, but you have more savings to be able to deploy. So the real question for us, and this is where I wanted to head, is reducing poverty going to be simply enough? Doesn't look like it. We need to do something more over here. And so how should we think about addressing these exacerbating inequality? We already started with a tough situation and it's gotten worse. So what should we think about doing post-COVID? And so I want to spend the remaining kind of time doing this, and then I'm happy to just stop and kind of take questions and kind of go into more a Q&A mode. So this is something, by the way, just to be clear, I direct a center at Harvard called the Center for International Development. And in this center, we're trying to do what, Michelle, you had said earlier, which is trying to create an option. Michelle Khan had said, how about an equity for all option? We're trying to really see, can we try and push towards equity for all? And in fact, can we think of COVID not just as a massive disaster, which it clearly is, but also as an opportunity to try and address this problem, which is an ongoing problem, which has been worsened by COVID, but perhaps COVID is something which can give us opportunities to address this problem. So let me explain what I mean a bit more by that, and then I'm happy to kind of open up for more. So at my research center, we're putting together a kind of multi-year proposal. We're calling it Beyond COVID-19, although sadly in many countries, we're clearly not beyond COVID-19. But really, we're beginning to think about what should the next 5 years of work look like? What should we be thinking of? And can we create this kind of global call to action? And the main thing is, can we pivot our trajectory, right? Instead of trying to just get back to the older growth trajectory, can we actually put ourselves, there are lessons we've learned in COVID, can we use those lessons to pivot to a higher growth trajectory so that 10 or 15 years from now, it's not that we are back to where we were hoped we would have been had COVID not happened. Actually, we're overtaken where we would have been had COVID not happened. Now, is that even possible? So that's the question we're beginning to pose. And we want to make sure that, look, COVID obviously is not just a health crisis, it is a development crisis. It's hit not just health issues. And when I be health, I want to be very clear. I'm not just saying health because of the loss of life and illness we've had due to COVID. In responding to COVID, as you all well know, we've created more health problems as you lock down. Now, again, it's a catch-22, right? It's what if you do, you're kind of damned. If you don't do, you're damned, right? And so when you try and save lives by locking down with COVID, you may reduce hospital access. So things like, we know this is true. We know immunization rates have fallen. We know maternal health outcomes are probably worse. We know people who had chronic illnesses, and if they don't receive healthcare, if you're diabetic and you don't get healthcare, if you need a dialysis machine and you're not getting there, you could be risking life as well. And we know that's happened, right? So there's a health trade-off on this. But then, you know, schools have been shut in most places for months on end. This is true in Pakistan as well. And by the way, that's also going to create inequality because the rich can compensate for education, the poor can't as easily. We know about social protection issues. We know there are issues in firms, you know, and that again is differential. We know there's problems at the macroeconomy, right? If you're Raza Bakir sitting here, you must be thinking very deeply about, gosh, what's happened to our balance of payments issues, our macro stability issues. And we know there are challenges on just state capacity and social cohesion. You know, we're blaming, when the crisis first started in many countries, you blamed outsiders for bringing in the disease, right? That's still continuing. You know, in the US, it shows up as anti-Asian kind of attitudes. But in every country, you have your own version of that attitude, right? And so it's going to be a comprehensive set of issues. But and this is where I want to argue, it also provides a global opportunity. There is a silver lining in this very dark cloud. And the question for us is, how much can we nurture, grow, sustain that silver lining? And so what we're trying to do is really create sort of a collaboration where we take advantage of the silver lining, both in terms of what we're doing in research or building capacity or coming together as researchers and practitioners to address some of these things. And partly how we move on this is the first thing, look, as much as COVID was a pandemic, it also revealed to us the information failure. It also is an infodemic in many ways, and people have talked about this. And so one thing we need to do for any response, especially immediate policy response, is we need to rapidly collect data. And so what we're proposing is, at least in our project, we're going to pick about 10 different countries across the world. And in each country, we're going to start essentially a life panel, a COVID life panel, which will, a panel data set is when you follow the same individuals. The individuals could be households, they could be firms, and you follow them over time for, say, every 6 months, you survey them over 5 years or so. And what you see is, this is a very powerful source of data because you see what the evolving situation is. And the reason this is important is sometimes it's not obvious. So I have a colleague, Professor Rima Hana, who does work in Indonesia. And when they were beginning to do this, they found that the people who are being hurt by COVID may not be the obvious people you thought of. So normally we think of poor people, say, in rural or remote areas. But what COVID did was, for a lot of people who are kind of lower middle income in urban areas, sort of laborers in urban areas, those people may have been hit the worst, because not only was the disease prevalence higher in those high density areas, they didn't have the social support infrastructure that you might in a rural area. They didn't have the food resilience or the food security that you might have had in a rural area. And even worse, those individuals were typically not in the social safety net, because typically they were lower middle income. So they were not regarded as recipients of standard aid. So even if you discovered that they were suffering, there was no easy way of giving them food stamps or BIS. Think of like BIS programs, right? Imagine if the person who's really hurt most is not the BIS recipient, but someone who's slightly above that, someone who's slightly above that target. And how do you deliver resources to them? So the first thing we're proposing is kind of seriously start collecting data on all these issues, which firms are hurting, which industries are hurting. We need to understand that if we're going to come up with any panel. Build capacity. One of the things that COVID revealed is the challenges of governments face, the capacity limitations on how to respond to a situation like this, where you need to rapidly make decisions, rapidly use data. And then obviously, you need to do research on these things. And when I talked about this silver lining, this positive lessons, this pivot, it's critical. The only way we will sustain that is if we do serious research on that. So let me give you one specific example. Think about education. Think about the seminar we're just having, right? The ability for us to use online tools in education was a known commodity. We knew this before. Right? We knew we could give, I've given online lectures all the time in the past few years. Yet the acceptance of that, the improvements in that, the ease and convenience of that, like this technology is much better than the technology that I had used in the past year or 2 years, right? Now the question for us is this just a one-time fix? Or are we going to figure out whether we can use this new technology forever? Is there a way we can incorporate this? And why is that important? Well, look, technology and access can be terribly unequal, but at the same time, it's also terribly equalizing in a good way, right? There are lots of people who do have access to technology. So we often talk about kind of technology inequality and bandwidth inequality, and I think that's real. But I think in that conversation, you forget that despite that, there still is a big positive access point over here. And so one question in education might be, and this is why it requires research, and actually I am working on projects with the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, and some of the team members are here, on how do we rethink education in a country like Pakistan? How do we bring in technology and data science to teachers in public schools and private schools and nonprofit schools, in a way that even when we go back to school, which still hasn't fully happened, but even as we go back, these tools can continue to be used. And the reason I think this is much more interesting now, and there's an opportunity, is not just has the technology gotten better, but there's something even more important than technology. Technology adoption is a big issue always. And one theory about technology adoption is it's hard to adopt because people are just kind of, it's costly, it's technically difficult. There's another set of theories, which I'm also very convinced by, is that there's a fear of technology. There's a lack of trust in technology. If you don't understand what I mean, think about when you give an iPad to a 5-year-old child and an iPad to a 70-plus-year-old person, and see how they react to the iPad, right? Both have equal resource constraints. They probably have equal free time. But one rapidly adopts and experiments and accepts, and the other sometimes is reluctant. I'm not always saying this. I have elderly people in my family who are phenomenal on social media, others who are less, right? But the point I'm trying to make it is technology adoption has a trust component to it. One thing COVID did is because it forced us all to jump into the technology bandwagon, the only way to build trust is to try it out. Like when I've had some elderly family member in mine struggle with the iPad, I've said, you know what, don't overthink it. There's no button you can press on the iPad which will blow the iPad up. Just keep pressing buttons. Eventually you'll get comfortable, right? So experiencing something new is a great way to build trust in it. What we have been forced the last year is to experience a bunch of new online tech stuff. And what I'm hoping is that's built a level of trust and created a window of opportunity that we can sustain. So that's just one example. But what I just said has a lot of ifs and buts and assumptions. And that's perfect fertile ground to do research. That's where research comes in handy. When you don't really know the answer, when you have a suspicion, when you think something may work, but you don't know for sure. That's where you want to try and do research and test different ideas out, do pilot grants, do full research projects, experiment. And that's going to be a critical component of what we're proposing, at least in what we're doing. And then finally, bringing people together. Look, my view is that even after COVID, conferences, workshops, gatherings will change in the world. I think we'll always have a hybrid component. And I actually think we should. First of all, that's great for the environment. We all don't need to be spending lots of fossil fuels and creating all sorts of pollution by flying everywhere. We're getting more and more comfortable in exchanging in virtual settings. So you can imagine hybrid settings. Some people are there physically, some people are there virtually. We'll have to think about how to get people equal access. There's issues around that. But that will allow for more global interfaces, for easier communities of practice to be built. And that's something I think the nature of convening, I'm hoping will change in a way that makes convening more global and more equal. Let me stop over here. Now, for those of you interested, by the way, we are going to, if you're interested in workshops and conferences and virtually joining, we are going to have our annual conference on inequality, actually, in the spring of 2022, and I'm happy to share with the PI team the invitation, so you can attend. So let me stop. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I think it's just better that way, and I'm going to open up for sort of questions. Idrissa, I'm back over to you. I don't know how you want to run this, but I'm happy to run it the way you think is appropriate.
So I would ask the people to raise their hands, and meanwhile, as people raise their hands, let me ask them, if you allow me, let me ask the first question.
Absolutely.
So, you say that you would help people to get used to technology and collect data on which industries are more affected and all that. But given that you have said that inequality is between countries, and so how you intend to create opportunities? Are you taking into account state capacity as well, and also the literacy rate as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's a great question, Idrissa. What Idrissa is saying is, look, Asim, you presented to us that most of the action is between countries. So shouldn't you be thinking at the macro level? Like you're trying to get countries to move up and down. And a lot of what you've said sounds to be at the micro-ish level. I think it's a great question. First of all, there is substantial inequality within country as well. As you can see, it's actually getting worse. Part of the reason, in fact, the way to think about it is part of the reason you have between country inequality, and this is the funny world we're in, because inequality is now getting driven more and more by a very few people, right? It's just the US has more Jeff Bezoses. Pakistan has fewer Mudassar Sheikhs, right? I mean, Mudassar actually is not even sitting in Pakistan, he's sitting in Dubai, I think. But he's Pakistani. And so for those of you who don't know, he's the CEO of Careem, and so an amazing guy. And so what's happening is that partly to even address between country inequality, there are two sets of things you do. One is we also, if inequality is going to be driven, or between countries going to be inequality is going to be driven by amazing entrepreneurs, we need to create our own set of Bezoses and Bill Gateses, and ideally in the same way that they've started. I mean, take Bezos's ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott. She has just been giving, she's a remarkable woman. She has been giving for the last 3 years, $2.5 billion roughly every year of her wealth. Just imagine that. Every year you give $2.5 billion to organizations in the world who are doing social good. And so partly this set of people, if we can create enabling situations, environment, and they become philanthropists, you can either say, I don't want these people. I don't know how feasible that is. Or you can say, let me make sure these people are contributing back in powerful ways to society. The second thing is what you said, Idrissa, which is systemic change, structural change, governance change in the country, system-wide change in the country, right? So it's not just going to be one individual or the other. It has to be that the state has to step up in a way that they can address inequality. That also has to happen. There's no way you can avoid that. And a lot of the ideas I'm seeing in the post-COVID reform is also building a state which is a more effective state using technology. I must say, look, I've been working with the Punjab Health Department, and I'm very impressed by them, both during COVID and also kind of in these recent months in terms of, first of all, I mean, this is a hats off to all frontline workers everywhere in the world, but especially in Pakistan. When the crises were at its peak, I was sitting happily remotely working, but all of these individuals were in the front lines and doing some pretty remarkable jobs. I've seen government officers working, getting very little sleep and just constantly working. So this need to respond was really spectacular. The other thing which for me was very assuring, Darisa, and I think is the silver lining, and I hope can continue, is the use of data went up. Even within the government, there was a constant demand to say even if the number was just what's the latest COVID prevalence rate, what is the mortality rate yesterday? Like I have been getting daily updates from various, I've spent some time with the Sindh government as well. I've seen the kind of statistics they're generating. They're getting daily updates on these numbers, and so that's a reassuring start. Now there's a question of what are we doing with those numbers? Have we effectively extracted as much intelligence as we could from those numbers? There's room for improvement, but the trend in the government to me is positive. I wish that this usage of data gets strengthened, supported, so that tomorrow, 2 years from now, even in normal situations, this data flow in government decision-making is becoming more and more acceptable, more and more used.
Thank you. So let me move to the floor. Professor Alia Khan. Dr. Alia.
Thank you, Idris. Let me see if I can phrase my question cogently. What is your impression about adaptation to a post-COVID environment in terms of how severe the hit the individual economies took? Because from a Pakistani perspective, the survey conducted by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, and now I'm referring more to the job loss and the firms and workers issues that you raised, the severity of the hit was not that high in terms of the time it took to recover after the lockdown was lifted. So how do you think that the realization that the post-COVID world globally is a different place is going to sink in terms of looking forward and adapting to what is more of a different global scenario than just a localized situation post-COVID? I hope I've been able to convey the message. Thank you.
Yeah, Alia. So I guess you were saying, look, it's not just an individual crisis, it's a global crisis. Normally, and this is the figure I showed you, that if every country in the world is hit, then there's no like standard aid showing from rich country to poor country expected. Is that a fair way to reframe your question, or was there another component that I missed? There were many parts to it, and I want to make sure I address all of them.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that if you take Pakistan's case, it stands out in some ways because the Pakistan economy did not take as big a hit from COVID because it was already slowing down pre-COVID. And now to operate as a developing emerging economy in a globalized world where some economies who took greater hits are making more serious efforts of reform and, looking towards, for example, platformization of work. I mean, do you see that kind of impetus in Pakistan as far as the firms and workers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't honestly know. I'm happy to turn this back to the audience as well. And I mean, what you're saying is right. There is a sense of exceptionalism, or there used to be in South Asia. The Indian experience was the same. India had declared victory over the crises, and then it turned out they got a massive wave. The question you were saying is, if Pakistan thinks it sort of escaped the crises relative to other countries, will we still have the same impetus to change? First of all, I don't think we escaped the crises. I think, sure, our mortality rate was lower than some other places. But I think if you look at the economic impact, and we'll have more surveys. I know Maruf is here, the CEO of SERP. Maruf, if you're listening, you could type in the kind of panel surveys SERP has been doing. I'm sure other entities in Pakistan will be doing panel surveys. I think there is a big impact in Pakistan. So partly, I think, Alia, the question for us is to highlight that.
Yes.
The question for us is to make sure people understand that, no, we also have been hit massively.
Right.
But also to understand that when the world gets hit, you also are hit. Even if you're not hit, your ability to export, your ability to engage in the world, your ability to be supported by the world is going to drastically drop. And so you need to be, if anything, more resilient. You need to be. So I don't think this is a call at any for complacency or self-congratulation. I think you're right on that. I think there's a call for saying, no, we're also in the same vein. And I think, Alia, the thing I was saying earlier, there is a global opportunity to act. This shock that I'm saying, and even if we were protected, that creates an opportunity for us as Pakistan to enter the world and take advantage of it. So if every country is now going online because of their personal shock, we should go online as well, even if we were protected, because it's going to give us a growth jump.
Exactly. Thank you.
And Maruf has typed in, if you want to look at this, at least the SERP has been generating this economic vulnerability assessment. This is a panel survey in Pakistan that's been going on, which exactly shows these kind of trends.
Okay, thank you.
In fact, I see Adil Bhai has connected as well. So he will probably have some views on the inequality trends. So I might draw on him at some stage. If he's there, I'd love to hear both him and Maruf if they have stuff to add to this conversation, because they've both been looking at it in different ways. Maruf, I don't know if you wanted to add something to what I just said in terms of the Dr. Alia's question about what your surveys are showing.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot. I think you captured it well, but the point is that I think I posted the link. Our survey, while not nationally representative, it does show fairly large income shocks, right? And especially troubling is the food insecurity that we're seeing, right? And people really, the behavioral changes that are happening in communities that we have surveyed at least.
And I don't know if Adil Bhai, if you're there or unmuted, I think Adil Bhai just joined. We were just discussing kind of Dr. Alia's question was, is Pakistan feeling complacent? And I know you've looked at many other countries and had sort of conversations with them. I don't know if you have the same sense. Is there a complacency in Pakistan?
Yeah, thank you for putting me on the spot.
I always return the favor.
But thank you. No, thank you also for the talk. I don't know. I think Alia is right. But if I can link it, I was listening earlier on my phone to your comments, and to link it to the important point you made about inequality between countries, and in the following fashion, that has also become very unfashionable to look at, including for scholars. I think because we are so better able to look at the local and national, and there is greater payoff, if you will, from social media to everything else. Therefore, the structural causes of that inequity also becomes, I know this from my area of climate change, where there is, which is clearly a global issue, as pandemics also are, but where the focus is all on what my city can do and my school can do and my community can do, which is correct, but it distracts from the global part. The reason I link this to, so I was really struck and very I learned when you talked about that. The reason I think this is also important is that one of the odd lessons of this crisis, in a way, it's somewhat of a wasted crisis, crises should at least be used, was just how absent any globalness was from any phase of it. We now talk about it in vaccine terms.
Yeah.
But earlier, if you recall, from masks to ventilators to global action, partly it was Trump, but largely it was other things. I know I've taken it on a different direction, but that too has led to this sense of complacency, if you will, that since every boat is on their own, a lot of opportunity for international action that could have worked differently. So the missing actor in all of this policy are all the myriad international organizations from ILO, right? So why is the international conversation on the redistribution of work that's happening in the world mostly absent?
100%. I mean, I think hit on exactly the. I mean, you'd think this was the time for this would be you could have told a very different story had it happened, which was this a time when the world got together, when WHO went in fully, when all these global organizations said, okay, we need multi-country coordination, we need. But I think you're right. It's shockingly absent. It's created far more parochialism and nationalism and xenophobia, if anything, than that. So I think that's otherwise, since you're here, I wanted to put a question back to you, and then I want to open up again. On the environmental side, this is something you've thought a lot about. So the initial was just a accidental boon, which is pollution dropped because we were not driving cars. But two questions to you. One, as we come back, do you see that little win just going away? And second, in that area, was there any global recognition or coordination because of COVID, or has that also gone the route of no cooperation?
So and again, thank you for putting me on the spot. But this really, we have a paper that's just about to come out at the end of the summer in Global Environmental Policy, looking at lessons from COVID for climate change. And at least I am not sanguine about it at all. So first of all, that assumed benefit we would get has gone away. It's not only gone away, and we haven't even seen the bump that's coming from everyone booking vacations to Disneyland, right? So right
the
after,
compensation for it, the correction back.
Yeah, I mean, I know our colleagues in Pakistan, but in Disneyland there is actually a clog of you can't get tickets right now, because as in the US people get vaccinated, there is this amazing urge to go out, to fly, to, we will see the business travel will come down. But the point there, here is what the numbers suggest. So in the beginning, you saw these pictures of roads in Boston getting empty. And you could, if you tried to drive into the city, you could see that what used to be a 50-minute drive has become a 30-minute drive. Here is the not odd, but unfortunate finding. That at this point, what we found is that there is really very insignificant drop in global emissions. Wow. Because we found other ways. It's very much like what young people are doing by saying, we won't own cars, but we will get Ubers.
Yeah.
So for example, just on traffic, the rise of home delivery more than made up for it and is far more inefficient. Right. So yes, there are other things, but it kind of washed out. And
on the global cooperation side, on that side,
this part I don't worry, because global emissions are so large that individual behavior has an impact, but it's industrial production, it's transport of goods, it's trade. The global cooperation is the worst one. So in the paper, what we argue is that there were these great lessons that could have been learned, which haven't been learned. Like everyone here got the first and largest truly global crisis of our life.
Yes.
And the absolute missing actor in that was anything multilateral.
Yes.
I bet you the last time you saw anything from WHO was about a year ago. We haven't even seen the guy because we shunted him out. And this is not just Trump and Trumpism. Germany, right? The model of multilateralism, back in April, says to Italy, which was then having its crisis, sorry guys, we can't send you masks because this may come here. So what were the first things we do? Not just the mask, a physical manifestation, close the airport, which makes sense, close your home, close your work. But we also closed entire opportunities of international cooperation where there were clearly visible gains to be made. And we ended up look at the vaccine last week, right? So in the US, one hand, 7 million vaccines are going to be thrown. Even as we announce, now we are going to go and give to some countries. So the waste you had by looking at it country by country, and the lesson for, I'm sorry I'm going on, I'll end on this, but the lesson for climate, I think, is very, very worrisome. So the lesson we learned was global cooperation is really not needed, and we can get out of a crisis without it. The lesson we learned was, even the science lesson, I think, is slightly unfortunate. We can solve this with the with science, and we can solve it by giving $1 trillion packages, not once but twice. The problem with climate is, if you try to solve it after the crisis, there is no vaccine for climate, right? So there aren't post-crisis solutions. The solutions are all pre-crisis, which we didn't do. And the second is, you can't spend your way out of climate change once it's happening.
Any silver lining, Adabhai, in your sight? Anything?
The silver lining we tried because we had to squeeze something into the paper. We said that maybe it is in the individual action, that maybe people will see that the cost of delay is far greater. Here's the last sentence, you might enjoy this. Imagine that in early 2019, you were the president and someone came to you, give me 100 billion only, and this crisis will go away, right? Knowing everything you now know. Wouldn't that have been a great deal, right? Just on a cost thing.
Yes.
Now, the climate silver lining is, I can give you the $100 billion number and tell you exactly what to do with it about a crisis that I can nearly certainly map scientifically on what are the type of things that will happen. Right. And so that's what people were looking at, this G7 meeting and the coming Glasgow meeting, that maybe we will have that. But there is a greater, the silver lining is, I think people, not in my life have I seen as many people as seriously interested in doing something, at least at the public level.
I mean, I wonder if, tying to the kind of the rise of the ultra rich, whether the McKinsey, Scott Bezoses of the world will be able to put together and give that 100 billion deal. Like, there are individuals capable of doing precisely that. Maybe that is the answer, that the coordination is not from the large multilaterals, but from that very right tail, which we are decrying, may have some individual.
You have people waiting on the queue, so I don't want to take up time, but the other good thing that came for all the economist friends here, 100 billion doesn't seem as large as it used to in January of 2019, right? 100 billion is an actual number. The Paris Agreement had 100 billion in it, and I and others wrote, yeah, this is monopoly money. No one has ever seen 100 billion. Well, now we have. And we've also seen how quickly it goes. Remember, the $1 trillion package ended in 2 weeks. It was all spent.
So thank you. This was a treat. I've always been a fan of Adabhai, so it's a treat for having joined. Idrissa, back to you to run the conversation. Idrissa, are you there or?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm here. So there are questions from the floor. I will take all. Asim, I hope you have time.
Yes.
But before I go to the floor, the point that Adil Saab raised to both of you, still there is some threat of recession. So then why global action is missing? Can Adil Saab or Asim, can you?
Yeah, so I have my theory, and let's see what Adabhai's theory is. I think it's exactly the human instinct of closure. Like, our first instinct, Adabhai gave a very nice visual, which is when you put a mask on and you shut flights down, if you're presenting, first of all, the crisis as a foreign import, the whole language on the pandemic was, it's the outsider who's coming in and bringing it. And I think at some very deep emotional level, that creates massive parochialism. But also, look, this isn't the backdrop of huge populism, right? There's a pre-politics to the crisis, which is just letting these populist leaders use that narrative very effectively. So I think it's a mixture of those politics, the sheer preventing travel as a way of doing it. There are all these factors which bring together. What I don't understand, and this may be Adalbhai's domain more than mine, is while that was true, why wasn't the global actor coming in and saying, I understand the natural human response for closing down, but guys, we got to coordinate on this. Why wasn't that voice louder? That I don't know. Otherwise, you're muted.
I also don't know.
You have to unmute. Yeah.
I do certainly think it's the moment. And it's the moment not just in the rich countries, but even in the poor countries. You know, think about how we in Pakistan talk about the United Nations. If I say United Nations, immediately everyone is going to say, "Yaar, unne to kabhi kuch nahi karta." Right? It's a tool of whatever. So in a way, the global institutions have been so sidelined, and for legitimate reasons, for inaction. So that is certainly the global moment. But in a way, I think we've also not celebrated what the cooperations that did happen. I mean, if you think about the vaccine story, I'm just finishing this book called Apollo's Arrow by this colleague at Yale on what has happened with COVID, and the scientific cooperation was truly global. Right? It's amazing that in 43 days, you have not only mapped the sequence, you have the first idea of a possible mRNA. Now, that didn't happen because of a company, though that's what we've been celebrating. What happened was in China, scientists mapped the first genome literally days. The WHO sent it off to others. Most of these vaccines are using that same sort of thing. So international cooperation was happening in a very different realm than international organizations. And that's the positive story of what was happening. Even in the response, a lot of what you were doing, what others were doing, there was a lot of learning from how to use Zoom to how to go online to that was happening across jurisdictions. So those were the positive sides. The negative side is that this comes at a level of great distrust for international and multilateral cooperation. My worry, as I said, is the crisis we are in preparation for, cannot be done without that cooperation, because the carbon molecule, even more than the coronavirus,
yes,
does not respect borders.
There's no masks. There's no prevent planes from flying, and you won't get the carbon molecule to show up. That's a very deep and damn point. One thing Adabhai said, which I think is important, Idrissa, to highlight, which I felt, and I think for Adabhai, someone as dean of a school, I was amazed at how much conversations between between academic disciplines. Like I've never talked to an epi person before. I was talking to an epi person, and they were willing to talk to me, and I was willing to talk to them. A great guy is Saad Omar, who's a Yale epi person. Saad and I were doing work together in Pakistan, and we met. He's a fellow Pakistani. He's a really nice guy. We met basically because I was desperate. Maruf is here. Maruf and we were desperate to find like a good epi person to work with on Pakistan. And we reached out and we created this great fun collaboration and work together. I think those sort of barriers for sure dropped. And I see that across all disciplines. Whether they'll sustain or not, I don't know, but there's a window of collaboration there.
So there is a question from Renchen.
Go ahead.
Renchen Ali. And there were Mahmoud Khalid and Zebun Nessa. I hope they're still here. So Renchen, please go ahead. After this, Mahmoud Khalid. Okay, Mahmoud Khalid, if you can go ahead.
I think Ringchen had typed his question, so I can answer that as well.
Sure.
It was a direct message to me, maybe because I think his mic isn't working. Let me just quickly read out Ringchen's question, because I think it was a direct message. He said, you talked about savings that made by the top 1% during the COVID period. Do you think this will lead to an economy heat up globally once those savings are put in place? Consumptions, could this build inflationary pressure, people impacting the poor again? So that's a great insight. To answer this, you need another person on this call. Unfortunately, isn't here, Atif, two people, either Atif, me, or Amir Sufi. Atif and Amir have been talking a bit about this paradox of like low interest rates and what the hell is happening. Why is money so cheap at one level? And when you get into this like negative interest rate trap, like if you're trying to stimulate the economy and interest rates are already incredibly low, how do you stimulate the economy further? But the reason they think interest rates are so low is precisely because you have these ultra rich who have a glut of savings, right? And so there's so much money in the world, and that creates its own bizarre perversities, right? But the problem is it creates an imbalance between saving and consuming / investment, right? Let me explain that. So if these ultra rich, and this, I'm just rephrasing Atif and Amar's argument, so please read their work. I'm just being an imposter over here. If the ultra rich don't consume stuff, like what more consumption can you do? How many tickets on the SpaceX flight will you sell, right? If you have so much money, and this is what Adil was saying, if you're sitting in the billions, there's not much you can spend on. And if you can't spend on much, this multiplier effect of creating consumption goods, creating investments to feed them starts dying out. So you spend on things which may not have huge multiplier effects. That's the concern. And I think this idea of the perversities of the very rich is a very interesting question, right? What does that super, super rich do? And I think because the spending patterns of the super rich are very different from the spending pattern of even the high income guys, that can create very interesting distortions in the economy, which can create these sort of cycles of low interest rate, low growth, low investments that we may be worried about. So I think that's a very deep question, but I would refer to their work. Mahmood, over to you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
thank you. It's really nice to have two geniuses in front of us instead of one. So it's good to have Adil Saab and you. My question is that, do you think that our future was actually brought to us more quickly because of this pandemic? Because the future of jobs was already changing. There was the 5th industrial revolution talk and how to conduct businesses like that. This is the first. Second, what's your opinion that how quickly we have to learn from this catastrophe and move towards the best path? Like we cannot wait for like the climate persons have yet to realize that what's the loss. The similar goes with this type of a pandemic. How quickly we have to come back to what is the best norm? Thank you.
Great. Well, let me first disagree with your first statement. I'm grateful for it, but genius is a term I don't use as easily, so I definitely won't use it for myself. On the kind of reasons to act, absolutely. Look, there's my wish, and then there's reality. In my wish, and perhaps in my dreams, I think of this, what I said earlier, as this is a massive push forward. This is a massive push forward for us to take on what I think is ultimately going to be, modern data science, modern technology. Look, I love technology, but I'm also sort of not naive enough to think that that's going to solve the problems. I think for me, it's the blend between human and technology. Technology's always been there. It's been there for a while, right? In fact, let me get back to education. What I find shocking about education is I was at a workshop with the colleagues of mine on education yesterday. We were talking about what's the bottom line in education. The bottom line in education has been, this is Jishnu Das, who's a colleague of mine at Georgetown, who's saying this, and I agree, is in the US over the last 50 years, there has been no change in test scores. At the same time, the infusion of technology in every other sector has been massive. So productivity, which is a measure we talk about, kind of how to make most of the resources you have, has actually strictly declined in education, definitely in the US and most likely in the world, at a time when we've had some of the biggest technological innovations that have happened. So the question becomes, if technology was a solve all or panacea, why hasn't that happened? Why are we still stuck in the same way? And it could be technology isn't useful, but it could also be we haven't been creative in how to deploy technology. The amount of faculty now on Zoom and the comfort level we all have on Zoom is just amazing, right? The fact that I could be teaching, I taught everything this semester on Zoom. It was tough, but some things worked better. I got more equal participation. I could have the chat feature. I could have students who are uncomfortable speaking, putting stuff in chat. And so the same is probably true for work. Like, could we, I was joking, otherwise said this point about home delivery and stuff. and what it may have created for pollution. But imagine if COVID allowed you to do much more online efficient delivery. It forced you to kind of do that. Could there be some remnants of that which become future of work? So I'm excited about that possibility. What gives me pause is the human tendency for hysteresis, the human tendency to revert back and say, "Acha, ye to kar liya tha, let's go back to same old, same old." That's a very powerful force that pulls us back, right? I don't know if it'll last, but these conversations, at least in my domain, are very much happening. Adil, I don't know if you wanted to, how you want to add to that.
Sajid Amin?
I think Adil Bhai was going to respond.
Yeah, Adil sir, please.
Since you were just only on one point that you started the question with, okay, did it fast forward the future? So I don't think we should think of the future as a straight line. Okay, there is a future predetermined, takdeer mein, or humne usko jump kar diya, we leapfrogged 2 years later. So a future is created. And once you make certain choices, now in different set of trajectories are before us. So had COVID not been here, I don't think we would have been on Zoom the way we are. But now that we are on Zoom the way we are, we can't go back and restart. So this notion that COVID was a pause, which we started with, there's a storm, we'll get into our home, close our windows, storm will finish, clean the driveway, go out. That is not what this is. Now a new reality has been created, and therefore, I think Asim was also pointing towards the same. A new set of future possibilities are available. And the future always belongs to those, I think, who grab the possibilities available at the time. If you again go back to literally a year ago, July of last year, there was a lot of talk about what was going to happen to supply chains. And some countries that hadn't been hit as much by COVID at that point were trying to leapfrog on the supply chain, Vietnam, for example, and so on and so forth. The point I'm making is a new set of future possibilities is now available, as it always comes. A crisis just raises a lot of, in the chaos, there is far more ability to grab the opportunity than may be in steady state. And I think that's where the policy window is. In the possibilities available now, whether it is on remote work, whether it is on change of education patterns, whether it is on production or moving from, ready in time to ready when needed production, there are new possibilities in the future that can be grabbed.
100% agree with Adil. So it's a very nice way of putting it. Thank you, Adil.
Sajid Amin. Thank you. Sajid Amin.
Yeah, now I'm on. Sir, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. A very interesting topic, presentation, and the conversation that is going between many of the ideals sitting in there. Dr. Adil Najam is there, Professor Asam. I just try to sort of have your thoughts on the kind of differentiating between the kind of transitory inequality and the structural inequalities that the pandemic has produced. For example, if I take lead from your presentation, the kind of the inequality that I have the impression that coming from forced drop in consumption because of lockdown, or the forced savings because you are not able to spend, is more of a transitory nature. And maybe it has a good explanation when you comes in the lockdown as a context. But once you go on the second phase, that is the recovery phase, I think that will more focus on how we deal structural inequalities. A couple of you have touched on education and others. So how do you see and one more thing that I would just like to highlight, that the most of the recent work that is going on, sort of the policy analysis, is making one error. It is reading inequality and the outcomes as a permanent and changed. But it's not reading policy itself has changed. I mean, if you see the monetary policy, it has shifted its focus. The first response of, like you have been talking about the drop in interest rate, I think instead of savings or sort of growth, it were more focused on maintaining liquidity so that businesses keep running, there are no job layoffs. So the objective function has changed of the policies. So I would like to have your thoughts on. Thank you so much.
Great. Maybe in the interest of time, we could get Idrissa, we could get one or two more comments, put them together and respond. I'll respond to this as well.
Okay. So Michelle, would you like to ask?
Yes, absolutely. So I had a bit of a question about billionaires and how to hold them accountable. So in the last year, there have been quite a few pandemic profiteers, people who have become billionaires as a result of the pandemic, particularly those within the vaccine domain. So they have amplified their fortunes, and there isn't really a way to hold them accountable in terms of public needs and distribution of vaccines and just equitable access to resources such as that. And even prior to the pandemic, like billionaires were making money and not paying tax and just evading their responsibilities. So I had a bit of a question about how do you hold them accountable, like locally, internationally? What's the way forward in that regard?
Great, thank you. Let me take one more.
Finally, from Talha. One more. Talha.
Thank you, Idrissa. Asim Saab, one of the key takeaways I took from your talk was that if Pakistan had a few more ultra rich like Jeff Bezos, and they were, sort of generous and benevolent, and they gave back to society in the form of foundations and charities, we could sort of reduce inequality over time. But I'm thinking, does this sort of shift the focus and the responsibility away from the government? And if we extend the Norway versus US example, which has been more successful in reducing inequality, aren't the states that are better governed and they have better welfare programs and systematic redistribution of wealth more effective in reducing inequality? Thanks.
Great. These are excellent questions. Let me respond to the last two are actually very related, so I'm going to respond to them together. On the first one, on kind of structural versus transitional, I think you're right. Look, for a lot of the rich, what I described, and Adil said this as well, the spending that was withheld is going to go back, and so it's just a question of the timing of the spending. That's true for the rich. It's not true for the poor. Right? For the poor, I think they have been hit with, job loss is not a transitional thing. You may be able to get the job back when the economy rises, but it's non-trivial, right? That first job you got was hard enough to get. It's not just an immediate thing. It's not, you can't take an intellectual sabbatical if you're poor and say, oh, I'm just going to take my time and then eventually I'll find another job. So I think the shock is going to create definitely components of structural inequality, and that difference between who gets structural inequality shocks and who gets transitional is also unequal, right? And so I think there you're spot on in that. The second part about how the state should act, let me kind of combine that response with the other two that Michal and Talha raised. I mean, both are really powerful insights. And let me be clear in what I'm saying. By no means am I saying let the billionaire solve this problem. Let me refer to this in a different way. So I've been interacting with this group of philanthropists called Giving Tuesday. It's an organization in the US. You can Google it. They're really interested in understanding global giving and giving. I mean, Adil Bhai has done work on this as well, which is charitable giving, and I think he's documented that a lot of countries like Pakistan are tremendously charitable countries. So it's not as if we're not giving charity or donating. Giving Tuesday has documented the same thing. Like the pandemic created more giving. If you look at the data, there's actually more giving during the pandemic than otherwise. What I'm sort of pushing for is a culture of giving. And Michal, to your point, look, you can go two ways. You can go one way, which is, can we hold certain people accountable? And I definitely believe in that. I definitely believe that part of what democratic institutions do or civil society does is to call out people, to bring in accountability. It doesn't have to be dharnas all the time, but kind of there is a sense in both citizenry through their votes and citizenry through their protests and citizenry through their activism can call out people. And I think that should happen. I'm fully supportive of that. That said, I also think there's an internal change that needs to happen. We need to bring in language, and this is what people like Giving Tuesday do, which is you recognize that giving also, sometimes when we think of giving, we make giving a privileged act. Let me explain that. Giving can only be done by the rich who can afford to give. giving is the responsibility of the state because the state technically is rich. It's a large entity. I don't want to ever have us think like that. I think we need to create a culture of giving where just as much as a rich person should be giving and is recognized for giving, in the same way a poor person can be giving and actually is giving and should be recognized for giving, right? The giving may be different. If you're really poor, you may not be able to give money. You may not even be able to give your time because you're so desperate to make a living, but you can give a positive attitude towards someone. You can give a smile towards someone. You can give, so I'm not trying to trivialize this, but I'm just trying to say there is a strong sense in collective creation of an object like giving. And my personal view is that's a stronger way to hold people accountable as opposed to starting off with, well, you have this and I don't, and so shouldn't you be giving more than I do? I'm not saying, Vishal, you suggested that, or anyone suggested that for that matter, but I think that's the language. Now, if you take that language, Talha, to your point, no one has ever been absolved of any responsibility, right? Citizens have to be in this culture of giving, but when you abuse a public property, you're not giving. Right? When you see trash in a park, you may be rich or poor. You can always pick the trash up, right? It takes 2 seconds. That's a giving culture. And look, whether we draw on our religious beliefs or our civil society beliefs or just good humanity beliefs, I think spreading that kind of language, celebrating that language is critical. We should celebrate it for the ultra rich. We should celebrate it for the poor. We should celebrate it for the state, which we don't. If anything, I mean, let me end with one of my pet peeves over here. My pet peeves is whenever I look at kind of shows in Pakistan, I don't as much because I get sad when I see them. Like any talk show, I've yet to go to talk shows where people are not, especially when you have people from different constituencies, just not fighting. Like it's such an unpleasant visual experience. You get there and some distinguished looking gentleman and a distinguished looking lady are just like shouting at each other. And I just don't, I just sit there and think, what culture of giving, of cooperation? Like, can you even say one slightly good thing about the other person? Just one. Just say, you know what, I disagree with this budget entirely, but this one element of the budget I think was great. Hats off to my, and for me, Adil Bhai is put the mic on. I'd love to hear Adil Bhai's views on giving because he's thought about this a lot as well, is creating that and enforcing that. Look, I'm a big believer in gender equality. There's a rule now in a lot of panels that I say, look, there has to be, if I'm going to host a panel, you can't have a panel without a woman on it. It's a mechanical rule. It sounds like a bit contrived, but it's a rule. It forces a discussion. I think I would like to say in discussion, say in any conversation, you have to say at least one positive thing. Otherwise, you shouldn't be showing up to this conversation. Otherwise, you should say one good giving thing. So that's kind of my view on this. I hold myself equally accountable for giving. I hold the government accountable for giving. I hold the poor people accountable for giving. I hold the rich people accountable for giving in their own forms, in ways that work for them. Adil Bhai, I don't know if you want to respond to the giving part.
Giving to me, but I think what you've said is exactly right. And also sort of maybe just the thought on giving is to, as you have done, for everyone to rethink what giving means. There is what you call the mechanical part of giving, which is the easier part. And also to celebrate the multiple ways that people do give. There is sort of empirical evidence that people actually give a lot in lots of ways, and recognizing is it important. I wanted to raise an issue that I was struck with the questions that Sajid also mentioned and others, but you may have raised it in the beginning. I caught most of your talk, but not all of it. So, but a question that keeps coming to my mind about the larger topic of COVID and inequality is that in the world we are entering, because of the choices we will make, whatever those are, there seems to be a great likelihood of also a reformulation of the class structure. Just in the realm of work, a new class structure is emerging. There is an underclass and there is an overclass. The overclass is if you work on a screen. Again, I'm thinking of the US. If you work on a screen, your workday will look very different. You will get the benefit of not having to go to work, not commuting. That is cost, childcare. Same in other countries. And I wonder if we are thinking also of what to do with that class structure, because in this fetish of the moment, I say that in a good way. Whenever things change, class also change. And I think class, again, with much smarter people here than me, is a different question from just inequality, because that is how the social structure gets cemented. And in many ways, I think the technology class structure change in Pakistan happening might be even more profound than in the US, because the ability to hold a phone, and then in many ways, I've come to now realize the phone you have matters. Right? It matters in a show-off way.
Yes.
Lekin that capability matters. We found this in COVID, not every phone can do Zoom class. And people who could have been okay on Facebook may not have the ability to do a Zoom class with the same facility that someone having an Apple phone or a laptop might. So anyhow, just wanted to raise this question for all of you as you study these. Okay, I think class will also be an issue that will become more and more prominent.
I mean, it is, to emphasize that, I know Maruf talks a bit about this. I don't know if Maruf, you're still there, but this tech access. Maruf is an ex-technologist, become policy person, I guess, or maybe continuing technologist and policy person. But this idea of sort of, otherwise exactly right, when we think of technology and the opportunities, is that creating a new class structure? And if it is, do we just live with it, or do we try and make that class structure be less of a class structure, make it more equal access? I'm obviously on the side. I love technology. I'm on the side of sort of dropping bandwidth costs, dropping device costs, helping people get usage. And it's not just dropping costs. It's that fear of experimentation. That analogy I gave about the 70-year-old and the 5-year-old is, well, within household analogy, but you can imagine that analogy also holds across rich and poor. Right? We know poor in general hesitate to experiment because it's costly. And so you can imagine the same thing, that it's a risk to adopt a new way of working. I can't just say, you know what, I'm not going to do the traditional way. I'm going to embrace technology and try to find tech jobs or invest in tech. And I think that also requires some additional investment and handholding on our part, both in terms of state and individuals. And so I do think that is going to become an increasing issue. We're going to start measuring, my guess, is inequality measures by access to technology, by access to bandwidth. I think we should.
Sorry to jump again. I want to highlight your Asim Nabatki is very, very important. You know, the literature on class, at least on the social science side, is very clear. Class is not just about wealth. It's always about access. It is always about access. आप अपने मोहल्ले में देख लें, the way you measure class is not by bank holding. It is about what things they have access to, what people they have access to, and now it is also about what technology they have access to.
Absolutely.
So great. So Azim Sahib, if you allow, may I ask a concluding question related to this? And there's a related question in the chat as well by Shahnaz. Do we need a shift in growth paradigm, given that state capacity is weak, given that we have these boom and bust cycle over the last 70 years, and our growth paradigm mainly has been give concession to this sector, that sector, or CPEC, or some fixed investment and all that. But generally, state capacity is weak, judiciary is not working, civil service is not working, our cities are not inclusive. So given that your talk has been on opportunities, do we need a drastic shift in growth paradigm?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I'm with Aludai on this, which is like words like drastic shift and linear policy trend. You know, these are words. I don't know how to ever actualize them in a way that I think is actionable. So for me, I never start by saying massive paradigm shift needed, or, look, there's lots of things to celebrate. Lest we forget, we as humanity have made incredible progress in the last 100 years. We just have. It's just been, the glass is always half full for me in these cases. The problems we're noting are problems of growth. They're not problems of decline in my mind. They're tough problems, but they're good problems to have, right? You take a country like Bangladesh. Bangladesh, I'm really impressed by. Bangladesh has done tremendous amounts of work. So for me, thinking of like throw away everything we've done and rethink and redo, that's never, I don't ever like that view, because I feel like there's lots of good that has happened. I love starting by celebrating the good, helping it encourage and grow and mature, and then take advantage of opportunity. So for me, it's less the paradigm. It's much more when there's an opportunity, take it. It's a beautiful gift someone has given. And if there is a structural change to be had, it's not because we desperately need it because our model is crap. It's we have an opportunity. COVID has given us this massive system level shock, right? And it's a chance. Like I've personally experienced a bunch of grief this year, and one thing I've had a lot of time to think about that at a very personal level. And I've taken that analogy at a kind of organizational, institutional level, which is, if you think of when is the last time you made a deep change in your life, you made a structural deep change in your life, it almost invariably will never be at a happy moment, at a successful moment. It's almost invariably going to be at a moment of crisis or a moment of shock or a moment of deep grief or a moment of deep questioning. It's not that your strategy was bad. It's just you get a little space for you to break off from your life, to that trend that Adil was saying, that line, you would just step back a bit and say, where am I? And can I do something meaningful to change it? And the way I think of COVID in that sense is exactly that. It is a collective grief we as humanity have experienced. It's really devastating for many individuals, right? Let's not just hide behind the numbers. It is personally devastating for people who have lost loved ones. There's no amount of money that's going to compensate for that, right? But for each one of those individuals, especially if you are one of those individuals, my condolences to you. But and this is the only way I'm surviving, is think deeply about that change in your life, that structural change, if you will, Adrisa, to your comment. I think countries and the globe has experienced that opportunity as well. What we have to do as kind of as supporters of that change is, again, get back to the giving point. Change is going to be hard. Even in that moment of opportunity, be supportive of each other. If you are going to give one thing, give each other the space to make that change, give each other the support to kind of get that change through, and most importantly, give each other the benefit of the doubt and the space to fail, because that will happen when you make that change. That's something we give very little of. We give very little space for others to make mistakes. I think we need to. So that's the last thing I have to say, Adrisa.
Thank you.
Back over to you.
Adrisa, would you like to conclude something? Have a concluding remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing me into this. I've learned much always from Asim. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Asim. It has been a great talk, and we have enjoyed it, and we have learned a lot. So hope to be interacting in future, and I hope that whenever you and others get the chance to visit Pakistan, things get better. So hope to see you people at PIDE. And my apologies again that Dr. Nadeem couldn't join.
I hope he's okay.
It has been.
Prayers for him.
Thank you all. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Advait. Thank you, Idrisa.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.